If you want to build a full custom subwoofer setup like this design, it's critical to start with a well-designed foundation. In this video, we're going to start the build process for this project with the construction of the subwoofer enclosure itself. Now, real quick, before we start, have you ever bought something and then 2 weeks later you go and you check the price and you see that that item is now on sale for less than what you paid? You think to yourself, man, should I return this item and buy it at the new sale price? Well, with Car Audio Gear, you can avoid that potential headache by shopping with our show sponsor, Crutchfield. That's because Crutchfield has 60-day price drop protection. A few months back, I personally had purchased some home audio gear from Crutchfield, and sure enough, a couple of weeks later, I checked the sale price and see that it's actually less than what I bought it for. After a very painless, quick 3-minute phone call, the return for the price difference on those items was processed to my account. Now, even better yet, Crutchfield has been super cool and hooked up our community with some special offers, so if you guys want to take advantage of those and save on your next car audio purchase, check out the links down in the video description. So in the last video, we came up with our design, and a quick reminder there as well, if you guys need assistance with a subwoofer box design, I can help, CarAudioFabrication.com. In the meantime, let's take our dimensions and head on over to the table saw. After carefully setting my blade height, I'm going to adjust my fence a little bit oversized for the first dimension and make my cut, and then I'm going to flip that board over, adjust the fence to its final dimension, and make my final cutting pass. The reason I like to do this is to remove any of the factory edges on each board. I do this throughout the cutting process so that I never have a factory edge, that way everything is perfectly square and nice and clean. To avoid any potential assembly issues, I also carefully label each piece as I make it. So I've already made the front and back of the enclosure, and with this piece I'm cutting here, I'm going to be making several different pieces for the sides and top corners of the box. To cut those pieces, I'll be needing to incorporate an angled cut, so I've busted out the old angle cube here, which I've zeroed to the work surface of my table saw, and I've attached it to the saw blade and carefully adjusted to 22.5 degrees. For this series of cuts, I'm first going to run a pass and remove the square edge, and now I can carefully measure out where I need this next cut to be. I then carefully line up that cut mark and make the next pass. It never hurts to just do a quick double check of the dimensions, which we are good to go on, and as you can imagine, I continue this process making the angled cuts as needed, and some of these pieces will have a square cut, so I return the blade back to 90 degrees and make those cuts. After labeling all of these pieces that make up the sides, the top corners, and the top of the enclosure, I do a quick dry fit just to make sure that everything is going together as designed. Nothing special on the final two pieces to cut, which are the bottom and the internal brace. So now that I have all of these pieces cut for the enclosure, I do need to do some detail work on one of the pieces. And that's going to be the baffle. I, of course, need to add the cutout holes for the two subwoofers to mount into. To make the cutouts, I'm going to be using these specific templates that are made for the Audio 12TW3, and these are from Mobile Solutions. These outer two rings allow us to do a flush mount if we wanted to, but in this case, since we're just doing a single baffle, all I need is the cutout hole on the inside here. Let's grab our T-square and start doing our layout work. When doing a layout, it's always a good idea to first mark the center point each direction of the board, and in this case, since my subwoofers aren't perfectly centered on those center points, I did have to do a quick dimension there, and now I'm drawing the center line for left to right of each. Having those lines allows me to line up these indication marks on each of the templates so that they are perfectly centered where I want them. Now we're going to go over to our rough cutting station, and here I'm going to use a drill bit to drill a starter hole, which will allow me to use the jigsaw and cut out our cutout hole, but in this case I'm saving about 1/8 inch of material, and you'll see why in the next step. In this case here, I'm using 1/2 inch template tape. I'm going to stick all these pieces to the back side of my template, remove the backing paper, and after carefully realigning with that circle that we made earlier, I'm going to use pressure to stick this firmly into place. Here at the router, we have a straight flute 1/2 inch flush trim bit that we're going to be using, and you can see that bearing rides against the template while the cutting flutes remove the material and perfectly match the shape. I'll use my pry tool to remove this template, repeat those steps, and of course make the second cutting pass as well. Now here's a quick little tip for you to remove the template tape quickly from the back side of the piece. Just use an existing piece of template tape. It never hurts to do a quick little test fit, so I grabbed the subwoofer here, and it looks like we are definitely good to go. So now we can officially move on into the assembly process, and first here, I'm going to sketch out some offset lines. Now, I forgot to mention this earlier, but I actually intentionally oversized the front and rear baffle for this enclosure, and you guys are going to see why after I assemble this box. For assembly, I apply some wood glue to each joint, making sure that I have complete 100% coverage. I'll use a clamp as a helping hand to perfectly line up the bottom of the enclosure with the bottom of the front baffle, and then I'm going to shoot a brad nail in which will hold that clamped force in place. I repeat this process of clamping and then adding brad nails along the total length of this joint, and then on the inside of this piece I want to make sure that I have good 100% glue coverage, so I just like to add a little bead on the inside corner. Continuing this process with adding the side piece, note that it's also a good idea, if you can, to sketch out the lines on the outer faces so that you know where the boards are going to line up. That way you can perfectly center the brad nails. That tip is especially helpful for when you're attaching pieces like this one here, this center brace, where you don't have the edge as a reference. That way you can perfectly line up those brad nails so that they perfectly secure into the wood. Now to apply those top angled corners along with the top piece, and I had a little bit more leeway here, even though that my cuts were pretty good. Having that extra outside material extending outside of the scope of the perimeter of this shape will allow me to make the cuts perfectly flush. We'll talk more about that in a second. Now, if I could jump in here really quick, if you're new to the channel, my name is Mark. Welcome to CarAudioFabrication. Here on this channel, together we learn how to master car audio and how to design, build, and install our dream car audio system. If you're enjoying the content, I would love to have you as a subscriber, and to all my current subscribers, thank you guys so much for being a part of our community. All right, my brothers in bass, check it out. We've officially got the sides attached, each of the corner pieces, the top, the center brace, and the bottom. Of course, the last piece that we need to attach is the back side of the enclosure. Just want to give you guys some beauty shots before we close things up here. But in the meantime, once again, I've taken the time to sketch out all of the geometry. That way I'm making sure that I'm perfectly centering each of my mounting brad nails to attach everything together. If we take a look at the side profile here, we can see that all of these pieces are nice and perfectly flush, ready to go. Let's get a complete layer of wood glue on here and attach the back panel. Now that I have the back of the enclosure attached, I'm going to use the subwoofer cutout holes to access inside here and do another bead of wood glue in all the corners just to make sure that we're perfectly airtight. If you did happen to have gaps between the different seams of your enclosure, you would want to use something like a silicone caulk in order to completely seal everything up. Now remember that we intentionally oversized our front and back pieces, and we're going to allow the wood glue to completely dry before we move on to the next step, which is going to be over at the router table. While that is drying, this enclosure is a little bit more unique because I have a number of different standoff pieces that I need to attach to the box. That's going to allow all of the different beauty panel parts to attach to the enclosure. So to get those made, it's back on over to the table saw, where I'll cut some thin strips and cut those to length, and then a little bit wider strips that are also cut to the appropriate size. On the back side of the box, I plan on mounting the amplifier rack, and for that I need several little square standoffs. So here's a really cool little tip for you on how you can cut multiple pieces to the same size quickly. My squares need to be 2 inches by 2 inches, so you just saw me make 2 strips that are 2 inches, and now I'm going to take this different piece. This is a piece of 1/2 inch material. I'm going to set my fence so that it's at 2.5 inches. That way it allows for that offset of that extra piece of material I stuck on there. And now I can quickly and easily cut multiple different pieces through this fence just by using the miter gauge pushing through. I don't want these standoff pieces to have hard corners, so I'm going to use this 1/8 inch roundover bit on the router and quickly just add a little curvature to each of the corners. You can see what that looks like here. I'll do that, of course, to the larger pieces as well. Let's check back in on our wood glue drying process. Boom! Through the power of video editing, our glue is now dry, and I have a 1/4 inch spiral flush trim bit loaded up. We're using a spiral flush trim bit because I have quite a bit of material to remove here, so I'm going to be going completely through this material without rough cutting. But my goal here, and the reason that I intentionally oversized all these panels, is now I can make this panel completely perfectly flush because we're trimming it based off of this geometry. So check it out, guys. Now the front and back pieces are perfectly flush with the rest of the pieces on this enclosure. And the huge advantage here is it would be very, very difficult to cut this to an exact size and then get everything to line up perfectly flush. You're always going to have a little bit of tolerancing issues. With this plan of attack here, we avoid all of that. and we have this cut perfectly flush. Oh, this is a bummer though. I had a brad nail that was sticking slightly above the surface, and I think you guys can see that I left a nice little gouge in my router table. That's something I usually like to check for before ever running an enclosure on the router table. I must have missed it in this case here. I've ground it down now in order to alleviate that problem, but nevertheless, keep an eye out for that, guys. I do want to use a round over bit to soften up some of these hard edges, but before I do that, I want to lay out some of my pieces that are going to allow for attaching the different beauty panel pieces. And the reason I want to do that is I just want to know where I should start and stop the round over in the different spots. Next, I need to attach all of these different standoffs to the enclosure, and of course I'll be using wood glue with some brad nails to secure them in place while the wood glue dries. But something that I want to do is I want to make sure that I mark out where I intend to have any mounting hardware that is going to hold the different pieces together. In this case, on these pieces here, that's in the center, so I've marked all of these out because I don't want to put any brad nails in that location. I want to make sure that they're good and far away from that spot so that I can have a threaded insert there in the middle. So now that I have all of those 1/2 inch standoffs attached to the back side of the enclosure for the amplifier rack, I'm turning my attention to the front side. And since I have that overlap area laid out, I'm able to perfectly locate where I need wood glue, and I will clamp each of these pieces in place and secure them with brad nails. So coming up, we want to give this enclosure much more of a finished look, and we also need to fabricate all of the different beauty panel pieces. So that means lots of custom fabrication techniques are coming in hot. Now, while you wait, if you'd like to see some more custom subwoofer enclosure builds here on the channel, check out these videos here on screen. Don't forget, for your next car audio purchase, you can take advantage of 60-day purchase protection and get a special offer for Car Audio Fabrication fans at our show sponsor Crutchfield, linked down in the video description. A big thanks to them, along with Jerry and the rest of the Patreon membership team, for making these videos possible, and thank you for tuning in and watching.